Chapter 1. Gemma Creed. With the disposable cell cradled in the crook of my neck, I waited for whoever had dialed my work number to say something. There was a long silence. Sometimes silence meant fear, and fear meant I could charge more. Is this Creed? It was a man's voice on the phone, unfamiliar and shaky. And given I'd led with my last name, he already had his answer. You've got 10 seconds to explain the job, or I'm hanging up. I stepped out onto the deck and shut the slider behind me. The chilled mountain air bit my skin even through my thick flannel shirt. From here there was nothing to see but sloped earth and a blanket of pines, all of it shrouded in shadow as night fell over the forest. It was peaceful, tranquil, and comforting, especially when times were rough. I'm sorry. I just didn't expect. I knew he wanted to say he didn't expect a woman. He wouldn't have been the first. At least he had the sense not to finish the thought. 5 seconds. If I did have to hang up on him, he'd call back. They always did. Better to play the hard ass than to let them think having ovaries was a weakness. Okay. I'll explain, he said. But it's just, well, you won't believe me. Goodbye. I pulled the cheap flip phone from my cheek, ready to clap it shut and end the call. A werewolf, the man yelled. I need you to kill a werewolf. This guy was scared. Good. I put the phone back to my ear. Who am I speaking to? My name is Robson. Glenn Robson. I'm a foreman for Timber Brothers Logging. We're working a job in Wekefrest, little town outside of Fairwater. I'd never been to Wekefrest, but I was familiar with Fairwater. It was only about an hour's drive from home. And what makes you think there's a werewolf in Wekefrest, Mr. Robson? It was here, came into our camp. I held back the first question that came to mind, how much alcohol had been in his system, and stuck to the not-so-insulting line of inquiry. And you saw this creature? I asked. Well, no, but my men did. The tale of a few drunks didn't make for compelling testimony, but they were slightly more reliable than the story of just one. And do they think it was a werewolf too? All except for Jim. Maybe Jim was the smart one. What does Jim think? Jim's dead. Okay, now I was definitely interested. A fatality meant I could charge triple or more. I was sorry this Jim guy died, but Mama's got to get paid. To be clear, how did Jim die? The werewolf killed him, snuck up out of the darkness and just went to town. And by went to town, you mean tore Jim to shreds. The werewolf cut him up with claws and fangs. Now we were getting somewhere. And where were you when this happened? I was hiding in one of the trailers. I think I passed out. What a coward. Chances were this was just a starved wolf that had wandered down from the hills. This guy probably could have saved his friend with a little loud noise. I can handle it, I said. What's the pay? I'll give you $1,000. Just get here and get rid of it. 1,000? I got more for the chupacabra I bagged in Texas last week, and that turned out to be a mangy coyote that had only eaten a few chickens. A dead human meant the job was worth more. I'm sorry, Mr. Robson. This sounds like dangerous work. I can't do it for that little. Fine. 2,000. Better, but he could do more. Just not worth my time to deal with those razor-sharp fangs. 5,000. And gnarled claws. 10,000, and that's it. Getting better still. I continued, ripping through tender FL. 15. Please. I'll have to dip into my personal account. I guess he'd had enough. You have yourself a deal, Mr. Robson. 15,000 for one dead werewolf. I'll meet you at your job site in Wekefrest. In the morning. I flipped the phone closed. 15,000. I slid the phone into my pocket and stepped back inside. The dry, smoky air from the wood stove was a welcome embrace. And my brother was waiting in his recliner by the fire. You're smiling. Miles narrowed his eyes at me, the same muddy green gaze that greeted me when I looked in the mirror. One of the few drawbacks of being a twin. Miles could see right through my bullshit. So? I can smile if I feel like it. Sure, but I know that grin. And I know you. You're scheming. I looked at my brother. He looked like a shell of the man he once was, overly thin, weak. Even the usual playful mischievousness of his expression had dulled. Hell yes, I was scheming, doing what I had to do. For him. What's the job? He asked. Nothing you need to concern yourself with. I avoided his gaze and went into the kitchen, then pulled out all the fixings for dinner: bologna, mustard, and bread. I'd never claimed to be a master chef. Are you taking a partner? Miles asked. I smeared the mustard around with a knife, put the meat on one more piece of bread, and then it was ready. I carried both plates to the living room. I know you can hear me. Miles accepted the plate I offered. Of course I can, I said, taking the seat across from him. And no, I'm not taking a partner. Why would I want to split the cash when I handle the job myself? The sandwich was a little off. Too much mustard. I took another bite. I know you think you have to carry this weight alone, but you don't. I can wait on the list just like. No, I met my brother's gaze. Gemma, it's okay. No, it's really not. You can't wait until they happen to get around to you. The doctor said it could take years. It's already been 14 months. Gemma, he was being calm, rational, reasonable. I couldn't. I wouldn't. I'm getting you into that trial. You're getting your heart fixed. Now eat your damn sandwich. He needed his strength, and I needed to come up with the money now. Time was running out. Even if I get the spot, if you can somehow come up with the money, it's not worth it if you get yourself killed. Miles frowned and looked down at his plate. I shrugged. I'll be fine. Now eat. He took a bite and I nodded. Good. All that was left was to let the nurse know I'd be away for a few days. Then I could pack 15,000. Finally, we'd have enough. Chapter 2. Sebastian. The narrow road was carved into the mountainside, curving along a jagged wall of rock. Twisted and battered guardrails were completely broken in several locations from past travelers careening over the steep cliff. I was content to heed the suggested speed posted every few miles and remain on the path. Growing up from the ravine were thick-trunked pines, old trees gnarled with the scars of every storm and wildfire they had withstood. Beyond the single road heading into the sleepy mountain town of Wekefrist, this place had remained untouched for hundreds of years. The deep dark woods called to my wolf with promises of long trails to run on and clear streams to drink from. Little daylight remained, the remnants peeking through the jagged needles of the treetops. Perhaps after night fell and business was completed, I would be free to roam the forest. One last curve, and a cluster of buildings came into view in the valley below. I followed the road down into town between log cabins and old stone structures and parked my rental in front of the quaint police station. The envelope on the seat beside me had all of the required information, false credentials and funds for my assignment. I had familiarized myself with the particulars before I'd left Fairwater. Now all that was left was the actual mission, which would have been better left to an actual field agent. I pulled my newly printed badge from the envelope and headed toward the building. The air outside was cool and crisp, fresh like mountain air was meant to be. It had been too long since I'd left the city. With one last deep breath, I grabbed the knob. The heavy wooden door dinged as I opened it, and again as it slowly closed. Itself. The interior was reminiscent of Mayberry, if the Mayberry PD had smelled like urine, and Barney Fife had a drinking problem. The red-faced officer with his boots propped up on his messy desk glared at me as I approached. Good evening, sir, I offered. The man grunted in response. So much for country hospitality. My name is Sebastian Wolfwood, Forestry Service Warden. The alias was a bit on the nose for my taste. The officer's gaze flicked up to meet mine. Oh yeah, they said you was coming. He swung his legs to the floor and brushed some crumbs off his uniform. Turning his head slightly, he yelled, Sheriff. The building was small enough to only have 2 empty jail cells beyond the desk, an open door to the toilet, and one closed door. That had to be the superior's office. Likely there was a basement as well, but I couldn't see a stairwell from the entry. After a few moments had passed, the door opened and a second man joined us. White streaked his cropped black hair, and scowl lines framed his squinted eyes. He appeared to be in his 50s, and to be everything the deputy wasn't. His uniform was pressed and crumb-free, and he carried himself with an air of confidence and, better yet, competence. This is the guy from the thing, the slob said. Sheriff Hernandez, the other man said, seeming to understand the nonsense. The other had spoken. Sebastian Wolfwood. Can I see some credentials? The sheriff asked. Certainly. I reached into my suit jacket and pulled out the fake ID the Tryon Tribunal had provided. The sheriff took it and looked it over. He bent it gently and moved the plastic around under the light. From what I had heard, he was a lot more thorough than most small-town police, and I was finally seeing that firsthand. Part of me wanted him to realize the ID was phony, because if he did, I'd be sent away. I had never had interest in field work, and preferred to return to my rightful place in the lab, even if it meant missing a chance to explore the woods. But I knew that wouldn't happen. The tribunal had the resources to make every false identity ironclad. Unless I turned into a wolf right in front of him, the sheriff would never have any inkling of the truth, not about me, and not about the creatures that existed out in the world. After what felt like an age examining my card, he handed it back. "Why are you interested in this case?" the sheriff asked. I wanted to tell him the truth. I wasn't interested in investigating the tax at all, but the Therion tribunal, who keep the existence of shifters and other supernatural things a secret, was human deaths at the hands of wild animals were always cause for investigation. There was always the possibility that stories of a starved wolf or rabbit bear could be referring to a rogue shifter. All it took was one mistake and shifters could be known to the world. Typically, a trained field agent would be sent to determine the truth, which, more often than not, turned out to be that the animal was not a shifter. With any luck, that was all I would have to deal with, a starved animal straying too far from his home, because I was most certainly not an agent. Yes, I'd had the required combat training, and yes, I could hold my own in a fight, but given a choice, I would much rather be in my lab working on research and hypotheticals, not in the field talking to people and collecting samples. The sooner I could return, the better. I realized the sheriff was still waiting for his answer. "Why here? Why this case?" "We're concerned about the balance of predators and prey in the forest. This may have been a rogue wolf, perhaps rabid. However, it could be that the rapid deforestation in the area is driving the wolves to hunt where they normally wouldn't. This case is crucial to my study of the impact of logging in the area." It wasn't completely a lie. As a tribunal biologist and wolfkin, I was personally invested in the impact of deforestation. But the truth of this case ran deeper, forged in other incidents, forged in the failure of others to determine what was happening in the greater Fairwater region. The sheriff nodded, seemingly appeased. "A lot of folk aren't too happy about the logging." "What about you?" I asked. "It's a complicated issue. The ones against it are older and set in their ways, eking out a living hunting and trapping. But the town selling the timber rights has brought a lot of money in. Money for schools and roads that we've needed for a long time. I guess I'd rather see the trees go than the town fall apart." "I can appreciate that," I said, and it was true. While the wolf in me would have preferred nature be left alone, the reality was never so simple. "Is this a convenient time for us to proceed to the scene?" "Of course, though Deputy Corning is in charge of this investigation." I looked to the slobbish officer, who was quickly shoving a flask back into his desk drawer. He stood and grabbed a set of keys. "Oh joy. You want to ride along?" he asked. I could smell the whiskey on his breath from where I stood. "I'll just follow you." Not far from the station, just outside the downtown area, I parked on a dirt patch next to the patrol car. The deputy was leaning on his vehicle, digging into his ear with his pinky as I climbed out of my rental and approached. His face was squinched on one side, reminding me of Popeye if Popeye lacked his signature arms and instead smelled like cheese and body odor. When I reached the front of his car, I expected him to start leading me off into the forest, but he just stood there. Was the body found here? I looked around in the dirt. There were deep tracks from large tires, likely from logging machinery, leading up between the trees, but there was no crime scene tape or other indication that we'd reached our destination. "Nah." I waited a moment for him to start walking or explaining. He did neither. "Can you show me where it was found?" With a heavy sigh, the deputy hoisted himself off of his car. "Over here." He walked into the forest, up the sloped hillside. I followed, taking note of my surroundings. We were far enough from civilization to be in the natural habitat of my wolf brethren. That didn't mean the assailant had been a wolf, but it did increase the probability. "Ain't nothing to see now," the deputy said. He was right to an extent. It had been over 48 hours since the attack, and the area had not been treated like a crime scene. The earth was disturbed not just with footprints but machinery. It was as if someone had driven over all of the brush in the area multiple times, trampling the natural growth, even though this did not appear to be where the logging was taking place. Retrieving any evidence or sample for the lab seemed unlikely given the destruction. There was the scent of blood. Human, but it was faint. The air was humid and the ground was wet, droplets of water pooled on broad leaves and clinging to broken twigs. When did it rain? I asked. I dunno, last night. This morning. So he did know. Which one? Both. I nodded. Something else lingered in the air, something familiar yet not. It was almost. Anything else I gotta do for you? He asked. I'm ready to hit the sack. It seemed early for bed, as the sun was only now setting behind the trees, but I chose to ignore the deputy and focused on the scent. There was an earthy quality that was reminiscent of wolf, yet different somehow. If only the scent were stronger. I walked a little deeper into the forest, searching for clarity, for something more to hold on to. Something sweet and pleasant cut through my thoughts, femininity and gardenias. A voice accompanied the scent, a curt tone with polite words. Excuse me. Her footsteps were soft for a human, hardly disturbing the ground beneath. I turned to see the woman walking up the slope from where we had parked. She was curves and conviction, thick in all the right places to make my cock stir. Her eyes were a hard hazel, with the authority of someone who was used to fighting for everything she had. Her hair was a mess of fiery red curls, which were complemented by her fair skin and freckled cheeks. She wasn't at all my type, yet the draw I felt to her was undeniable. The deputy moved faster than I'd seen so far, jogging down to meet her. Halfway. Whoa, little lady, he said with his palms upraised. We've got an active crime scene here. At this point that was a stretch. I'm gonna need you to just head on back into town, the deputy said. I didn't need anyone else snooping around. That was my job. The woman dug into her pocket and pulled out a card. Gemma Creed, Forestry Service Warden. Nah, that ain't right. We've already got the warden here. The deputy turned to me. You know this gal? I did not, but I couldn't admit it because there was no such thing as a Forestry Service Warden. Not anymore, at least. It was a position recently cut during budgetary redistribution. Of course, I said. Miss Creed, if you would assist me over here. The deputy shrugged and let her pass. I crouched down and pretended to examine the grass. Gemma, if that was even her name, bent down next to me. Her shirt was loose, revealing the tops of her breasts as she crouched. They were big and round with a few freckles decorating her creamy skin. Where else did she have freckles? I averted my gaze. She spoke softly so the deputy wouldn't hear. Who the fuck are you? Harsh, though I agreed with her sentiment. I too wished to know who she was. Sebastian Wolfwood, Forestry Service Warden. We both know that's bullshit. There is no Forestry Service Warden. And if there was, he wouldn't wear a fancy suit into the woods. Fair point. My attire wasn't well suited, pardon the pun, for this excursion. Y'all doing okay over there? The deputy crossed his arms and looked back, down toward where the cars were parked. Gemma lowered her voice further. Did Robson hire you too? I have no idea what you're talking about. I had no idea who Robson was. Listen, Sebastian, if that is your real name, I'm getting that bounty. Don't get in my way. Gemma rose to her feet. I did the same. The deputy rolled his neck and crossed his arms. Can I go now? First tell me where I can find Glenn Robson, Gemma said. The foreman's probably with all the other loggers, hanging out in their trailers and whatnot just over the ridge. He gestured out into the forest. Good luck to yous. And with that he hobbled back down toward his car. There was quite a bit to unpack in the events that had just happened. The foreman of the logging company was offering a bounty on whatever had killed one of his men. Interviewing potential witnesses was next on my agenda, but that information was not included in the tribunal dossier. Not only that, but to maintain my cover story, I was going to have to pretend to work with a human bounty hunter, which would make the entire mission more difficult. I was utterly fucked, and not because I wanted nothing to do with this mission or the fact that I was forced to work alongside a human. I was fucked because that human without question was my mate. I turned to question Gemma further, but found she was already gone, racing up over the hill. Her ass was pleasantly round, and I enjoyed the way her hips moved as she ran. More than ever, I longed for the peaceful monotony of working in my lab. The entire mission would be more complicated with her involvement. And because this woman was my mate, it wasn't just the mission that would be more difficult, but my entire Chapter 4. Gemma. The headlights flickered and the suspension creaked as Grinder traversed the lumpy dirt road. The heat cut in and out, blasting me with shots of air at sporadic intervals. Surprises made life interesting. I'd inherited the beast of a truck from my dad, and I wouldn't trade her for the world, no matter how noisy she became. The bench seat jostled with every pebble and crack in the road. Smooth riding had never been my jam anyway. The little metal charms dangling from the rearview mirror clinked together and twisted around. There was one for each creature I had hunted. There was one for Bigfoot, one chupacabra, and an alien spaceship from that crazy trip to Flat Salt. If I could find a wolf charm in Wickeforest, I'd pick up one of those two. It didn't matter that none of the monsters had been real. The hunt was the fun part, even if part of me hoped one day I'd be wrong. One day something might just be real. Maybe. If not, that was fine too, because I'd have enough money to pay for Miles's surgery. This was it, just this last job, and I'd have enough. A flash of lights flickered across my rear view. I glanced up just in time to see Sebastian's gray rental car take a sudden left turn off of the old dirt road. Oh hell no. We'd agreed to head back to the motel. He must have gotten a lead that he wanted to keep for himself. Well, I wasn't about to let him lose me that easily. I pulled the e-brake and twisted the wheel, spinning oil grinder a full 180. Then I slammed on the gas and swerved in behind where he had turned. Shit, this was not another road but a driveway instead. I stomped on the brake and drifted to a halt in a small gravel parking lot, right next to Sebastian's rental. Next to, crookedly flanking whatever. Up a few dirt steps from the lot was a single-story log cabin on a tiny hill. The sign by the door read Bruce's Butchering and Fine Leather Goods. Weird, what kind of butcher was open this late at night? I snagged my keys and jumped out of my truck, careful not to bash my leg on the step on the way down. A gust of cold air cut right through the thick fabric of my shirt and bit my skin. I grabbed Sebastian's door handle and opened it. His dark eyes flashed. Good, let him be surprised I'd caught him. Just what do you think you're doing? I leaned my hands on the door frame, blocking his path and towering over him. Light from the cabin's porch lamp broke through the windshield, bathing Sebastian in a soft glow. The suit, the hair, that chiseled bone structure, he really was sexy. A sexy prick. I shook. The thought. It's a butcher shop. I'm hungry. Seriously? That was his story? He was probably used to getting by on his looks, charming his way out of trouble with a smoldering wink and a grin. Not that he was smiling or winking. How did you even know this place was here? I asked. Just followed my nose. What kind of line was that? This guy was so full of shit. The question was, when did he pick up this lead? Before I'd shown up at the crime scene or after I'd started walking away from the loggers? I couldn't let him out of my sight for a second. Would you mind taking a step back, please? He asked. I'd like to go inside. Of course he would. And really, what was I expecting? He'd change his story and head back to the motel just because I'd caught him in his lie? I wouldn't. If it was me. I narrowed my eyes at him, just to make it clear I wasn't buying his story. Then I moved to let him out of his car. You coming too? He asked. Damn right I am. All right. That always cool as a cucumber thing he was doing. I wasn't going to let it give him power over me, even if it was infuriating. I followed Sebastian up the steps that were carved into the dirt up to the cabin. His fancy pants framed his ass pleasantly as he walked, showing off a perfectly grabbable shape. Not that I was looking. At the top of the steps, I moved up next to him and kept my eyes forward as he opened the worn wooden door. A little bell jingled as we stepped in out of the night. Right away, the smell of smoked meats and treated leather hit me, that and the dry heat of a wood stove. All sorts of leather clothing and accessories were hung around the large open room: jackets, boots, slippers, bags. There were bird feeders hanging on the wall next to antlers and fishing rods, knives and machetes. Seemed there was quite a variety of wares, none of it my thing, but these kinds of shops weren't uncommon in the mountains. At the far end of the room was a counter with a glass front displaying various cuts of raw meat. A short man with a white beard stepped out from a door behind the meat counter. He had a flannel shirt on and laugh lines by the corners of his eyes. With a white beard instead of black, this wasn't the guy who'd been hanging around the logging site. Good evening, folks, what can I do for you? He rested his arms on the counter, and I noticed the stains on his calloused hands. This guy probably made most of the stuff in here himself. I'm looking for some venison, maybe some smoked backstraps. Sebastian didn't look the type who would know what to ask for. Hell, he didn't look like the type to be comfortable in a place like this, but here he was surprising me. Again. Sure, said the man behind the counter. How much you looking for? However much you think I can stuff into a motel refrigerator. Weirdo. Why would he want that much meat? Was it just to mess with me? It had to be, right? Sebastian was really going all out trying to make me believe his story that he just stopped in here for some meat. You got it, buddy, the butcher said, and began to cut at a large brown slab of smoked venison. Either the two of them knew each other and hid it really well, or Sebastian had questions to ask this guy. I walked over to the counter, determined not to let him beat me to the punch this time. Excuse me. I looked at the little gold pin on the butcher's white apron. Bruce, just like the sign on the door. No surprise there. Yeah. He spared me a glance while keeping most of his attention on his task. Did you hear about that logger who was attacked? I asked. Oh yeah, real tragedy, he said in a tone that sounded sincere. Your shop is pretty close to the logging camp. Did you see or hear anything that night? Sebastian asked. There we go, so he did have an agenda. Or he was following my lead. Nah, I live upstairs too. I sleep like a log and didn't hear a damned thing, Bruce said. It was enough distance that his story could be true. I'd heard of people sleeping through worse. I looked to Sebastian, wondering if he believed this guy's story. He gave nothing away. Big surprise. Ever speak to any of the loggers? I asked. I don't know, maybe one or two stop for some meat from time to time. Bruce said. In this small of a town, he'd know who had stopped in, especially if they were strangers. And what did you think of them? I asked. When they stopped by. Or how about, in general, how do you feel about people tearing down the forest? The butcher shrugged. Everyone's got a job to do. That's true. But doesn't their job make yours harder? Do you hunt all of this yourself? I asked. He turned away from his work to smile at me. He was clearly proud of his business. Something was off about his mustache, but he turned back before I could get a good look. Oh yeah, everything here I took from the forest: deer, boar, quail and ducks. Even a bear once or twice a year. You won't find more fresh or natural meats anywhere. It must upset you that the loggers are destroying the forest you depend on, I said. Bruce didn't answer, but I could see him tense up. He turned and leaned over the counter with Sebastian's giant sack of meat. Here you go, buddy, that'll be 37 even. This time I could see his mouth clearly, and a shiver carried up my spine. The thing on his mustache, it was bloody meat. Bruce, do you make a habit of eating raw meat? I asked, the thought making my stomach turn. If there really was a werewolf, he'd sure as hell like eating raw meat. The butcher backed up a step and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. A flash of anger crossed his face. Yeah, okay, sometimes I eat a few chunks of hindquarters with a little salt and pepper. Ain't nothing wrong with. I always wash my hands before I prep the customer's meat. Of course, I said. The butcher's shoulder dropped. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to blow up like that. Talking about the logging always gets me riled. Didn't he just shrug off the questions about the loggers? Apparently his feelings were stronger than he'd let on. Don't worry about it, I said. You won't find any shortage of folks who dislike the loggers, he said. Yes, them cutting down the forest could hurt my business. But what does that have to do with anything? The sheriff's office may have concluded that the logger's death was a wild animal attack, but our office needs to confirm that independently. Sebastian flashed his fake badge. Bureaucrats, right? I offered what I hoped would be a reassuring smile. Hee, yeah. Bruce smiled back and nodded. You know who you ought to talk to? Jeremy McAllister. Why's that? I asked. Jeremy's dad owned property the city needed before the loggers could get access to the town's timber. Little strip of property needed to make an easement. After old man McAllister died, Jeremy's brother Colin sold it. Heard Jeremy didn't see a dime. I don't think anyone's more bitter about the logging than him. Do you know where we can find him? Sebastian asked. Oh yeah, he lives at the Pineview Apartments in town. Thank you. Sebastian paid the man, took his giant bag of meat and headed out the door. I chased after him and waited until we reached the parking lot to talk, so Bruce wouldn't hear us So what's your take? I asked. That whole meat on the beard thing. Suspicious, right? But I didn't get a murderer vibe off of the guy. Then again, if he really is a werewolf, he could be capable of anything. He was truthful in most of what he said. Really? That's all you have to tell me, Mr. Human Lie Detector? The guy said. He didn't know if the loggers had been in. I put my hands on my hips and watched Sebastian lean over to put his meat on the passenger seat. I said most. Sebastian stood and met my gaze, towering over me. Everything. Important. I'd say all of it's important. Best part was the bone he threw us and you. Bad choice of words. Anyway, ready to go find this McAllister guy. In the morning, Sebastian said. Hell no, I'm not waiting for morning. I scoffed. You don't want to come. Fine. You go back to the motel and enjoy your fridge full of smoked meat while I find the truth and claim the rest of the bounty. He said. What? You made a point to say that we were going to go to the morgue together. We'll question the suspect together as well, so as not to blow our cover as the same agency. Okay, he had a point. But why not go now? Why wait until the morning? Sebastian lifted his brows and slid one hand into his pocket. Totally nonchalant. If we're going to maintain the story that we're just doing what we must, bureaucratic redundancy, we can't show up on doorsteps in the night. The story is a lot more plausible if we wait until morning. Fair point. Again. You just want time to brood and chew on that jerky you bought to prove a point. His brows rose again. This time it seemed I surprised him. He pulled his hand from his pocket and leaned closer to me, tilting his chin so his hot breath tickled my ear. I wanted to grab his lapels and shove my tongue down his throat, then knee him in the balls while I ran off to do this case my way. Instead I stilled, breathing him in and waiting for him to speak. I have nothing to prove, Gemma. His voice was dark and rough, and it did things to me. Okay, so maybe it wasn't kneeing him that I really wanted. Wanted to shove him against his rental and tear into his clothes like an animal. Something about this guy drove me wild and I both wanted to resist and wanted to give in. I don't believe you, I whispered. He sucked in a breath and took a step back, then another. Then he opened his door and I saw a playful sexy glint in his eye. You will. Chapter 6. Gemma. Stakeouts suck. It could take hours and hours of waiting, only to spot a raccoon chilling out in a dumpster. This one was better than most because of the company, but my butt and back still hurt from all the sitting, and it had only been a couple of hours since we'd stretched our legs. First thing we'd done was traded cars, and I'd hassled Sebastian about it, even though I knew as well as he did that his boring tan sedan would blend in better than my big black grinder. We'd grab supplies, gas station snacks, naturally, and we'd sat, and then we sat some more. For a while I'd played music, especially since Sebastian had been so aloof. I tried talking to him a few times, but he'd just give one-line answers. What type of music do you like? Classical. Oh, do you have any favorite jams? Favorite composers? No, it was like he wanted to just sit in silence, alternating between staring at the apartment building and at his phone, so I let him. And I wiggled around because people were not meant to be stuck on their rears for hours at a time. It was dark, so McAllister probably wouldn't even notice if I just walked around in circles a few times. Or he could, and the whole day would have been for nothing. I rolled my shoulders and stretched my elbows to the sides, careful not to bump Sebastian, though maybe if I had he'd say something. And I had this feeling Sebastian was watching me. I met his heated gaze and my mouth went dry. Only my mouth. When he looked at me like that, my skin grew hot, my nerves raw. My breathing quickened. He was so close and he wasn't looking away. Dropped my arms back to my sides, clenched my thighs together and tried to think of something clever to say. We never discussed the body, I said. His eyes lingered on my face, and I found it hard not to look at his body. He was close, extra close when he turned toward me like that. The slab of torn-up dude that was Jim the logger, I said. Smooth, real smooth. You're a biologist, right? Sebastian blinked, but he didn't move away. I've never seen a wolf leave markings quite like that, he said. How about a bear? I asked. Unlikely for the area, but more consistent with the wounds. His hand tightened on his phone. Was it a reaction to what I'd said? Did he have something on the case he wasn't sharing? What are you reading on your phone? I asked. He turned, facing forward again. It was what I wanted, right? Cool down the sexy thoughts. Then why was I disappointed it was working? Sebastian. He frowned. You're not going to hold out on me now, are you? I touched his wrist, tempted to grab the phone out of his hand to see for myself. He shot his attention back to me. I haven't seen any sign of wolves, no fur, no footprints in the forest. And you think going for a walk is enough to know? There's something different about this case, Gemma. Different than what? Different than it should be. What does that even mean? I asked. He wasn't making any sense. Show me what you're reading. Is it Wikipedia? You can't trust. He handed me his phone. On the screen was some kind of official report. Scroll through to the right, he said. I flipped through, reading some of the text on each page. Seattle torn apart. Beyond recognition. Sightings of a monster covered in fur. They were medical. And police reports from different towns spanning over the past few months. I don't understand, I said. These can't be real. It's why I was sent, Sebastian said. Similar accounts have been occurring in the area for some time, and no one has determined the cause. So you work for a hunter organization or something? I asked. It was far-fetched. Maybe some billionaire had nothing better to do with his money than pay a team to try to prove the existence of paranormal creatures. Or maybe it was bullshit. Or something, Sebastian said. I flipped through more documents, more pages, and then I stopped. This document was different. It looked like a scan from a really old book. The page was yellow and tattered, and the text was handwritten. At the bottom was an illustration that looked an awful lot like a horror flick werewolf. What's this? You can't believe that there really is a werewolf out here. Can you? I searched his face for answers, for a smile that said he was just fucking with me. Nothing. I'm not so sure anymore, he said. Well, I'll tell you, I've been on a dozen cases just like this, and it's never a real monster. The answer's always mundane. Tall guy with furry jammies who likes to take midnight walks, an albino dog with a skin disorder, that kind of thing. He studied my face. Does that disappoint you? Was I that easy to read? It's fine, I said. It's just a job. I wouldn't have guessed that. He held out his hand for the phone. Let him think whatever he wanted. I ignored his hand and read through a bit more, determined to get everything out of this opportunity that I could. Lycanthropes, human-wolf hybrids, blah blah blah, a curse that is passed on through saliva. Causes fever, then craziness, and then painful, horrible, unavoidable death. Note to self, avoid the bitey bits. Not that I wouldn't have anyway. I handed back the phone. I'm not convinced, I said. You shouldn't be, he said, surprising me. Then why'd you show me? Because you asked. If only life was always that simple. Sebastian was anything but an open book. He was a book so closed it was cemented shut. But in that look, in this one admission, maybe I chipped away a piece of that cement. Can I ask you something? His brown eyes were completely sincere. He wasn't distant, not staring at his phone. He was completely present. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I really was breaking through, not just in chips but with a sledgehammer. Sure, I said. Do you like your job? Funny, I hadn't really considered in a long time how much I liked doing any of this. It started as a hobby, chasing ghost stories in the woods when Miles and I were kids. But then he grew out of it and I grew less hopeful. I dabbled in bounty hunting petty criminals, but it wasn't the same. I guess I do, I said. You seem surprised. I don't know about surprised. It's about need, you know. And you need the money. It didn't sound like a question. I guess my motivation had been pretty clear when I'd accused him of trying to steal my bounty. And maybe again when I'd shoved handfuls of cash down my pants in the foreman's trailer. Oh, you know, I have fancy taste. Caviar and diamonds and such. Liar. His dark eyes flashed, sending a shiver down my spine. Okay, it's for my brother. I didn't want to talk about it. I never wanted to talk about it, and here I was bringing up my personal problems and I didn't even know why. I could have just left off with the caviar. Sebastian put his hand on mine. It was such a simple gesture. One that showed he actually cared, one that made me feel like it was safe to tell him. He needs surgery, I said. For his heart. There was a frog in my throat, and I could feel the tears beginning to. Well, tears I didn't want, tears I'd held back for so long. How much more do you need? He asked. I cleared my throat. This is it. All I have to do is finish this case, kill a werewolf. when it turns out that the whole thing's a sham like all the rest? It's why I'd insisted on half up front, but I couldn't get screwed out of the other half this time. Then it would have to be one more job, and Miles might not have that long. Sebastian looked out the window, probably lost in thought over the bombshell. I dropped on him. It was too personal and I regretted it. Kind of. It was still nice to talk to someone even if I hadn't meant to. So, I said, you never did tell me what's with the suit? What do you mean? Well, sure, you've got the body that was born for. You like my body? The corner of his lips turned up. Wait, you're changing the subject. I shook my head. The body born for what? He asked. Climbing all over. Ooh, licking all over. To pull off a suit well. That's all I was saying. How had he flipped our dynamic around on me so easily? It was supposed to be me making him squirm, and here I was drooling over his grin and his chiseled jaw and his Gemma look. I followed Sebastian's gaze to the second story of the apartment complex. Sure enough, there was Jeremy McAllister, slinking out and closing the door gently. Behind him. Yes, finally. This is it, I said. Let's go. Sebastian didn't reply, and instead just rolled down his window. He tilted his chin like he was sniffing the air outside. What a weirdo. What are you doing? I whispered, making sure McAllister didn't hear. Something's not right, Sebastian answered softly. He wasn't putting up the window and he was making no move to get out of the car. Yeah, we're letting our guy get away, come on. I opened my door and climbed out. McAllister was all the way down the staircase and almost to the last car. Parked in the row. Either he was off to drink and fight or off to bite. I crossed my arms and leaned on the passenger side door of Sebastian's rental, wondering if this guy was going to get in the last car or if he was going for a walk. Maybe Sebastian already knew, and that's why he was still sitting in the driver's seat. Some weird sense that told him whose car belonged to who or something. Sounded about right. A metallic clang carried down the street. My best guess it came from the dumpster beside the car. McAllister froze in his tracks. Chances were the result of this stakeout was going to end like so many others, with a raccoon and a dumpster. There was a second much louder clang, well, more of a bang really. Maybe it was a really big raccoon. Gemma. Sebastian climbed out of the driver's side door. His eyes were wild, and his stance was defensive, like he expected to brawl. What? I whispered back. Get the rifle. Rifle? Neither of us had carried a gun through any of this. Not that I didn't have one in the glove box of my truck, but the trunk popped open. I ran around back and sure enough there was a rifle in his trunk. I grabbed the gun and moved to the side of the car. Sebastian was gone. What the hell was he thinking? I scanned the street until I found him, halfway down the sidewalk toward the dumpster, stalking slowly, silently in the shadow. Again, what the hell was he thinking? McAllister yanked on the driver's side door of the car. Come on. Maybe it was jammed, or maybe it wasn't his car. I lifted the rifle, putting McAllister in my sights, keeping my finger far from the trigger. I'd learned to shoot when I was little, and I knew better than to touch anywhere near the trigger when I didn't mean to shoot. The dumpster screeched and skidded across the path away from the brick wall, right at McAllister. Metal crashed on metal as the side of the car caved in. Glass shattered, and I looked for whatever the fuck through the dumpster. There in the shadows, a creature the size of a bear stalked out on all fours. An enormous raccoon on steroids. I'd never shot a bear and didn't want to. If this thing even was a bear. But I'd do it if I had to. I crept closer, searching for a sign that McAllister wasn't plastered between the car and the dumpster, but also keeping quiet and far enough not to alert the bear. I glanced back to where Sebastian had been, but I lost him again. My stomach clenched imagining him wrestling a damned grizzly, getting himself torn up for a job. Stupid. He'd be fine, he had to be fine. There was movement by the dumpster, a barrel-chested beardo McAllister. The bear spotted him too. It rose up on its hind legs, standing at least 8 feet tall. The legs were too thin and long, the body too top-heavy to be a healthy bear. Elongated, fur-covered arms hung at its side, ending in sharp claws. The canine mouth hung open, showing off a hell of a lot of stabby fangs. It was a fucking real-life werewolf. I moved my finger to the trigger, but before I could line up a shot, the werewolf bolted towards McAllister and tackled him to the ground. Shit. I cursed in my head, forcing my mouth to stay shut. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't, not without attracting the beast's attention. I lowered my gun. There was no way I could fire now. I could hit McAllister. It was too hard to see what was happening. I had to get closer. From behind the dumpster, a way too well dressed for this shit idiot appeared and dove toward the werewolf. Sebastian, don't! I yelled. I ran for them. All I could think of were those damned files, fever, then craziness, and then painful, horrible, unavoidable death. He was supposed to be avoiding the bitey bits. The werewolf looked up as Sebastian dove into it headfirst, knocking it off of McAllister. I threw the gun over my shoulder and pulled the hunting knife from my belt. I couldn't let him get himself killed. I wouldn't. I ran and leapt over McAllister, who laid motionless on the ground, covered in bloody gashes, to where the werewolf had Sebastian pinned to the pavement. Sebastian held tight to its hairy wrists, keeping its claws from his throat. He couldn't die. Tears welled in the corners of my eyes. Fear, fury, adrenaline, something fueled me, and blood pumped loudly in my ears. I took my knife in both hands, raised it over my head and plunged it deep into the monster's neck. It howled and lashed. In a flash I caught a glimpse of terrifying yellow eyes, of hooked claws and blade-like fangs that pierced my side in white-hot. Chapter 8. Gemma. Sebastian didn't protest as the deputy forced his hands behind his back. He didn't say a damn thing as the red-faced idiot clasped the cuffs on. Fury boiled my skin, making my ears and face burn. I wanted to scream. The deputy grabbed Sebastian's box and led my partner out the door. Couldn't let this happen. This couldn't be happening. You've got rights and stuff, the deputy said. You can get a lawyer and I might write down what you say and use it against you later. You can't do this. I followed them into the hall. Deputy, wait. The sound of McAllister's laughter carried out from his room. Laugh wheezing. If the bastard wasn't already beaten within an inch of his life, I would have punched him in his stupid face. He'd lied and the damage was done. What the hell happened now? I followed the deputy and Sebastian to the parking lot, where the deputy put my partner in his squad car. He didn't do anything, I said. It's okay, Gemma. Sebastian looked completely calm. I didn't understand how. I was pissed. Like hell it is. I'm all right then. The deputy climbed into the driver's seat and drove away. I was fuming, weirdly energetic and boiling with rage. Literally-ish. My skin was hot like I had a fever, and the desire to stomp back inside and tear that asshole anew. Well, that urge was only growing as I watched the squad car drive away. I needed some space from this place, some time to think. The deputy would probably try to call the forestry service, only to find out that Sebastian was a fraud. Then he'd be in even deeper shit than he was now. Not on my watch. It was up to me to save his well-dressed ass, drive down there and what? Break the door down, bust a few heads? The idea was surprisingly appealing. What was wrong with me? I wasn't thinking straight. I hopped in my truck and started driving. I took all the windy roads away from the police station. My brain was weird. My body was weird. And I was starving. It had to be the bite. It was like rabies. Strange ravenous animal takes a chunk out of your belly and bam, you're also a crazy ravenous animal. But there was no skin missing from my stomach, no sign of the bite at all. The deep wounds had healed unnaturally fast, and there wasn't even a tiny mark left, as proof I'd been bitten. Even my eyes felt different, like one of those allergy medicine commercials, where they take off the foggy filter and the person sees vibrant color for the first time. It was like that, like my whole life had been the filter and now I could truly see the world as it was meant to be seen. Also, something was screwed up with my hormones. I'd been into Sebastian before, but this morning I felt like being close to him was akin to breathing. Like I was always meant to find him and spend my life with him, like if I didn't start making babies with him right this second, my insides would explode. Or maybe the explosion thing was just my stomach. I had to eat. Now. Up ahead there was a little gas station. I pulled off the road and went in. It was small and dingy, devoid of human life, and smelled so strongly of lemon. Cleaner that I could taste it. But there was food. I scooped up everything I could fit in my arms from the shelves. Didn't matter what was there. My skin was on fire and my stomach felt like it was both full of bricks and so empty that I was going to have to chew on my arm if it took much longer to find something. I dropped a mountain of chips, cakes, and dried meat sticks down on the counter. There was a little bell there beside the register, so I rang it. No one answered. My skin was getting hotter like it would boil off. This was taking too long. I tore into one of the meat sticks and shoved the whole thing in my mouth. Tasted like both the best and worst thing I'd ever eaten. I chewed a few times and swallowed the greasy, fatty product. It was a lump slowly sliding down my throat until finally it settled in my stomach and relief washed over me. Relief and cool calm. Rabid wolves get hangry. I tapped the bell again, this time without worrying that I'd bite someone or chew off my arm. Hello. I called toward the back room behind the counter. No one came out. I pulled out the cash I had in my wallet, left it on the counter and scooped my snacks. Opening doors with my arms full of junk food. Not so easy. Climbing up into my truck with my arms full, also not so easy. But once I was settled in chowing down, I felt more and more like myself. Okay, so I needed a plan. Well, I wasn't going to be able to drive in and demand the cops release my partner. If that was all it took, the deputy would have given in already. Could call and pretend to be someone else and demand his release, come up with some bureaucratic nonsense about reports and marks in their records or something. Fat chance that would work. I couldn't even convince myself. Maybe the sheriff would be reasonable. It had been the deputy who'd taken Sebastian in. I could just tell his boss the truth, most of the truth, and he'd see reason, right? Reason was the way to go. I turned the key and grinder purred. I patted the dash, threw her in reverse, and hit the gas. On my way back to town, I went over the details of the story I needed to tell. That knife had only been used on the wolf. The blood on there, it didn't belong to McAllister. That should be enough evidence. Plus, with a little pressure applied just right. All right, a nasty threat. The sheriff would have to let Sebastian go. Testing will prove that the knife in question wasn't what caused that asshat's injuries. Sounded not too bad. Plus, shouldn't the doctor at the hospital be able to tell that it was claws and not a knife? I bet he could. That's the kind of thing they'd say on a crime show. The depth of the wounds was too. No, the depth and striation of the wounds doesn't match the blade of the knife. That was better. Believable enough too, since it was the actual truth. A squad car whizzed past me going the opposite direction and I didn't catch who was driving. With any luck it was the deputy. I was tempted to follow and see what was going on, maybe another attack, there was a werewolf out there. After all, and I didn't mean me. This thing I was dealing with was a death sentence. First I'd go crazy losing my humanity entirely before I ended up inevitably dead. I knew that. I'd read it in Sebastian's files. But that didn't mean I had to go down easy or without saving both Miles and Sebastian first. The other guy had gone crazy. Sure, but he hadn't kicked it yet. I just needed to keep eating and watch out for the wolf temper. And I'd be fine. I pulled up to the station and found the lot empty. Maybe both the sheriff and the deputy were out. I walked up to the front door, replaying my plan in my head. Tell the sheriff the blood on the knife isn't human. Unless werewolf. Blood still came up as human. Still, it didn't belong to McAllister. At the front door I tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I banged with my closed fist on the wood. It's Warden Creed. Open up. I listened for footsteps or voices. There was only silence. Sheriff. I knocked some more. Nothing. A wave of heat flashed over my skin, and before I knew it I was twisting the hell out of that handle. The thing snapped like it was made of glass. Pieces of shattered, twisted metal fell to the ground and the door creaked open. Oops. Well, it was done, might as well go in. So much for doing things the reasonable way. It was dark inside, lights off, blinds shut. I cautiously stepped in and scanned the area where the desk was and looked to the cells, which happened to be empty. Were there more downstairs? I took a few steps farther, listening for anyone who might still be here. What kind of rescue would it be if I ended up in a cell too? I went past the desk, around the corner to the stairwell. The light downstairs was on, and a silhouette carried up the hall. There was a staticky click and a somewhat garbled voice spoke. Noise. Complaint at 405 Oakview. Proceeding to scene. Copy, said a second, garbled voice. That address sounded vaguely familiar. But if I was hearing both the sheriff and the deputy on the walkie, who the fuck was walking up the stairs? Someone else worked here? My mind raced, looking for a cover story if I had to give myself up. Certainly wasn't looking to get arrested or worse, shot. I grabbed the floor lamp from the corner, planning to. I didn't know. Then the shadow became a man. and just before I smacked him in the face with the end of the lamp, I saw who exactly I was assaulting. Sebastian. Chapter 9. Sebastian. A black rod whipped around the corner, aimed straight at my head. I caught the cold metal in my fist an inch from my face. Sebastian? How did you? I'm so sorry. Gemma. I hadn't heard her enter the building while I'd been downstairs, though I'd recognized her scent on my way up. The attack, though, was completely unexpected. Her cheeks were rosy, her lips gently parted, and when she met my gaze she softened both in her stance and in her steely expression. A rush of excitement washed over me. I loved the effect I had on her. Hello, I said, and let go of what appeared to be a standing lamp. I didn't know it was you coming up, Gemma said, and I came to rescue you. Tada. She put down the lamp and mock curtsied, and amused as I was, I had to ask, was the lamp a part of the plan? Spur of the moment, she said. Really, I'd have preferred to talk some sense into the cops, but it doesn't seem like you needed rescuing after all. Did the sheriff get pissed when the deputy brought you here, and reasonably decide you didn't belong in jail? No. No. Her eyes narrowed. So you were able to convince the deputy? No, I said. I didn't do that either. So then how did you escape? I held up a finger. Hold that thought. I passed her and continued what I'd been doing when she'd arrived, searching for my lab kit. Seriously. Gemma crossed her arms and followed. The sheriff's office door was shut, but given he hadn't been in, the case was unlikely to be inside. The sheriff seemed smart enough not to entrust his deputy with the key. I checked down in the morgue, so all that was left was the deputy's desk up here. Even the deputy isn't dumb enough to leave you walking around in here. He'd have thrown you in a cell first thing. So what did you do, turn into a chicken to fly the coop? Gemma's hands were on her hips and the scowl she gave me promised I'd soon face her wrath if I didn't explain. I slipped out, I said. Of the cell? You can pick locks or something. I nodded. It wasn't a lie, I could pick locks, though her sarcastic guess about the chicken was more accurate. I'd shifted into a wolf, not a chicken, and slipped through the bars. I couldn't tell her that, though, even if I wanted to. It wasn't the time or the place. The more time we spent together, the worse I felt about holding back the truth. Gemma was my mate. At some point I had to tell her everything or she'd never trust me, even after I finally let her in. That was a problem for later. I'd tell her later. I wish I could pick locks, she said. Would have been helpful getting into the station. I'll teach you. I knelt down behind the desk and checked the drawers. There, in the footspace, was my case. I frowned and dusted off the crumbs that were sprinkled on top. The deputy had no respect for anything. Oh yeah? I might just take you up on that, Gemma said with a smile that didn't meet her eyes. Sometime. Strange. She always said what she meant, and this was different. Ready to go yet? Gemma asked. I heard a lead from a walkie just before he bit me. The crackled voice coming through the walkie without question belonged to the deputy. Sheriff, I'ma need some backup. My nose, it's bleedin'. Bad. On my way. The second voice belonged to the sheriff. Earlier the deputy said he was going to 405 Oakview for a noise complaint. Sounds hella familiar, Gemma said. Tell me you know where the action's going. Down, because I just can't place it. I knew exactly where the deputy was, the butcher's shop at the edge of town. A noise complaint doesn't necessarily indicate our wolf is involved, I said, though the biting part was certainly suspicious. The last thing we needed was the possible contagion spreading. You don't think it's worth checking out? Gemma gave me a pointed look. On the contrary, I absolutely do. The address the deputy indicated earlier belongs to Bruce's butchery, where I stopped for meat. All right then, let's go. Gemma grabbed the walkie from the desk, and I followed her outside. The sun was lower in the sky than I'd expected, late afternoon or early evening. Already, when I tried to shut the door, I noticed the knob was missing. No, not missing, but in pieces on the ground. She must have bashed the thing with a sledgehammer, which would only be somewhat surprising. We climbed into her truck and she started driving with my lab kit and the walkie between us on the bench. How pissed do you think the deputy'll be when you come strolling in? Gemma glanced over at me. Hard to say. Before he left, he did a fair amount of pacing. He ignored the sheriff's request to check in, and he refused to allow me the phone call I reminded him he was legally required to provide. So, he might just want to forget the whole thing ever happened? Gemma asked. He might. Who would you have called? Do you have a buddy at the office who substantiates your aliases and promises to raise hell if they don't listen to you? Pretty much. The tribunal had offices entirely dedicated to accurately representing human law enforcement agencies. There was one in the same building as my lab. Must be nice, she said. What do you do when your cover story is called into question? I asked. She twisted her fists on the wheel and grinned. Improvise. That sounded about right. There were 2 squad cars up ahead, parked in front of the butcher shop. Gemma pulled off the road and parked on the other side of the small lot. From my seat inside the truck, I could hear muffled yelling. Do you hear that? Gemma reached over and opened the glove box in front of me. She grabbed a pistol from inside. Yes. Stay behind me, she said. I appreciated the sentiment and trusted that she would have my back. I hoped she'd always feel that way, that she'd grow to feel the same way I did about her. But I wasn't afraid of the deputy or of the monster. I wasn't afraid of anything that could be done to me, only what could happen to her. We climbed out of the truck and I let Gemma take the lead but stayed close. Her shadow, her guardian. I'd protect her with my life. The sounds from inside the building grew louder as we approached. 2 voices. One quiet and calm, the other loud and blubbering. From right outside the door I could make out the words. Where did the butcher go? The sheriff's voice was the calm one. I don't know. He just... The yeller was the deputy. Gemma looked at me, her hazel eyes sparkling with amusement. She leaned her head close to the door and listened. He bit me. The bastard fucking bit me. I know, the sheriff said. I told him to be quiet. He said no. Then he just bit me. Corning, focus, the sheriff said. Where did he go after that? The woods. I don't know. He's crazy. I'm gonna shoot that bastard. I'd heard enough. We had a chance to catch up with the butcher before the cops did. Gemma seemed to have the same idea because she took off toward the woods. I ran to catch up. There was no scent of wolves in the air. Beyond the aromas that belonged in the dewy forest, there was only the 2 of us, and a hint of raw meat and human sweat. It was impossible to know for sure if the butcher was the werewolf until we actually saw his body transform, since I'd yet to scent wolf on anyone in human form. That alone set the creature apart from shifters. On a first encounter between 2 shifters of any kind, each would instantly recognize the wild and familiar scent that was unique to us. The ground closest to the shop was well maintained, even as the trees grew closer together. The farther we walked into the forest, the more brush appeared on the ground, but still there was a well-worn path to follow. The butcher knew these trails, he'd made them, and Gemma, even without shifter senses, seemed to know which way to go as well as I would have if I were in the lead following the butcher's scent. Perhaps tracking was a part of the survival skills she'd learned from her father as a child. Gemma's footsteps were surprisingly silent over broken sticks and fallen leaves. That, too, spoke to her training. Gemma froze. I listened to the forest, to the rustle of leaves in the frigid breeze, to the woodpecker chipping away at one of the trees in the distance, to the sound that did not belong with the rest, the sound of a human. Gemma pointed up ahead. I had to move slightly off the path to see around her. And then I spotted him. The butcher was keeled over on hands and knees. The sound that came from him was a desperate wheeze, wet and suffocating. From here I could see his wounds were extensive, deep gashes leaving his clothes in tatters. He was worse off than McAllister had been. The butcher arched his back and then collapsed. Gemma took slow, measured steps closer. I could smell the metallic scent of his blood, hear his shallow breathing, his weak pulse. Until they stopped. I put my hand on Gemma's shoulder. He's no longer breathing. She turned and looked at me, her big hazel eyes filled with questions. How can you tell? From this distance, Sebastian, how can you tell? The way she asked, it was like she already knew the answer. And I wanted to tell her. I had to tell her. I couldn't keep lying, not to my mate. Gemma, Something in the air changed, causing the hair on the back of my neck to stand on end. It was a feeling. And then a scent. The werewolf. Bile churned in my gut. And there, movement between the trees. Gemma turned, pointing her gun to the left, scanning the forest. Did she somehow feel its presence too? Shifting earth, rustling leaves, it was close. A bang left my ears ringing. Gunfire. Gemma's shoulders recoiled from taking her shot. There was movement ahead and Gemma slammed back into me, knocking the air from my chest as my back hit the unforgiving trunk of a tree. She fell to the ground, tackled by the beast. Fury filled my veins, fury and fear. No one touched my mate. I had to protect her. I tore the clothes from my body and let go of humanity.